Jessica Tarlov calls John Kennedy a psycho on live TV. Then Kennedy makes her regret everything. The Fox News studio buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, producers darting between monitors, makeup artists touching up panelists, and the low hum of anticipation as the countdown to air ticked closer. The set, bathed in sharp white light, gleamed with the polished sheen of a stage built for high-stakes debates. At the center of it all sat Jessica Tarlov, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her notes neatly stacked, her eyes scanning the room with the intensity of someone who'd spent years sharpening her arguments like a blade. Across from her, the other panelists adjusted their earpieces, their faces a mix of focus and fatigue. The topic of the day was energy policy, a dry subject on paper, but in the hands of seasoned commentators, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. No one could have predicted that spark would come from Tarlov, nor that it would ignite a firestorm that would consume the nation's attention. The show, The Five, was a staple for millions, a daily ritual, where liberal and conservative voices clashed with just enough civility to keep viewers hooked. Tarlov, the resident liberal, was known for her sharp wit and unflappable demeanor, a counterweight to the conservative heavyweights who dominated the table. She'd sparred with the best of them, her arguments rooted in data, and delivered with a cool confidence that made her a fan favorite among some and a lightning rod for others. But today, something was different. The air felt heavier, the stakes higher, though no one could pinpoint why. Maybe it was the news cycle, thick with stories of rising gas prices and pipeline disputes. Maybe it was the audience's growing frustration, palpable, even through the screen, with politicians who seemed more interested in sound bites than solutions. Or maybe it was Tarlov herself, her jaw set a little tighter, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. The host, Dana Perino, kicked things off with her trademark poise, framing the discussion around a recent Senate vote on energy subsidies. The panel dove in, voices overlapping, as they dissected tax breaks, renewable energy, and fossil fuel dependence. Tarlov leaned forward, her hands clasped, waiting for her moment. She'd prepared extensively, her notes filled with statistics on carbon emissions and job losses in coal country. But as the debate unfolded, the conversation veered into murkier territory. Personal attacks, veiled jabs, and the kind of rhetorical posturing that thrives on live TV. One panelist, a gruff conservative commentator, took a swipe at leftist pipe dreams that would bankrupt the working class. Tarlov's eyes narrowed, but she held her tongue, letting the moment pass. Then another panelist chimed in, praising Thupper-Ngisi John Kennedy from Louisiana for his common-sense approach to energy policy, citing his recent speech on the Senate floor, where he'd called for deregulation to boost oil production. That's when it happened. Tarlov's restraint snapped like a taut wire. She leaned into her microphone, her voice cutting through the crosstalk with a clarity that made the room freeze. John Kennedy isn't offering common sense, she said, her tone sharp enough to slice glass. He's a psycho, a relic who's peddling dangerous ideas that belong in the last century. His obsession with deregulation is reckless, and it's going to ruin lives. He's unfit to lead on this or anything else. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. The studio went silent, a rare moment when even the hum of equipment seemed to pause. Dana Perino's eyes widened, her hand hovering over her notes as if searching for a way to pivot. The other panelists stared, mouths slightly agape, caught between shock and the instinct to jump back into the fray. In the control room, producers scrambled, their voices crackling through headsets. Did she just say that get ready to cut to commercial? Tarlov sat back, her face a mix of defiance and dawning realization. She'd crossed a line, one she hadn't even seen until it was behind her. Her heart pounded not from fear, but from the adrenaline of saying what she'd been thinking for months. Kennedy, with his folksy drawl and penchant for colorful metaphors, had long been a thorn in the side of progressives like her. His speeches, peppered with Southern charm, often masked policies she saw as backward, harmful even. But calling him a psycho on live television, that wasn't part of the plan. She'd meant to critique his voting record, to dismantle his arguments with facts. Instead, she'd lobbed a grenade, and now the fallout was beginning. The audience at home, sprawled across living rooms and bars, erupted. Phones lit up with notifications as viewers took to social media, their reactions a chaotic blend of outrage and glee. On X, the hashtag Tarlov attacks. Kennedy shot to the top of the trending list within minutes, accompanied by a flood of memes, hot takes, and video clips of Tarlov's outburst. Jessica Tarlov just ended her career, one user posted, racking up thousands of likes. Finally, someone said it, another wrote with a string of fire emojis. The clip itself, a 15-second snippet of Tarlov's words, was shared millions of times, each view amplifying the moment's weight. Back in the studio, Perino regained control, steering the conversation to a safer topic. But the damage was done. The energy in the room had shifted like a storm cloud settling over the set. Tarlov's fellow panelists glanced at her, some with raised eyebrows, others avoiding her gaze entirely. She kept her eyes on her notes, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper as if anchoring herself against the chaos she'd unleashed. Behind the scenes, the Fox News machine kicked into overdrive. Producers huddled in the control room, debating how to handle the firestorm. "This is going viral," one said, scrolling through X on his phone. "We need to get ahead of it." Another suggested issuing a statement distancing the network from Tarlov's comments, but the senior producer shook her head. "Let it play out. This is ratings gold." They knew the audience would be glued to their screens, waiting for the next act in this unexpected drama. Meanwhile, Tarlov's phone buzzed incessantly in her purse, messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers piling up. She didn't check it, not yet. She knew what awaited her, a mix of support from her base and vitriol from Kennedy's supporters, who revered the senator for his plain-spoken style and fierce defense of Louisiana's interests. Across the country, in a modest office in Washington, D.C., John Kennedy sat at his desk, a cup of black coffee steaming beside him. The news of Tarlov's outburst reached him quickly, a staffer rushing in with a tablet to show him the clip. Kennedy watched it in silence, his face unreadable. His staff, a tight-knit group accustomed to his calm demeanor, waited for a reaction. Would he fire back with one of his signature quips? The kind that made headlines and delighted his base? Would he demand an apology, or worse, a retraction? But Kennedy just leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his eyes fixed on the screen as Tarlov's words looped again. "Psycho," she'd said. "Unfit." The words were harsh, personal, designed to wound. Yet Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or slam his fist. Instead, he turned to his chief of staff and said, "Get me on a plane to Louisiana tonight. I want to talk to some folks back home." His staff exchanged glances, unsure what he meant. Was he retreating, ignoring the attack? But those who knew Kennedy best recognized the look in his eyes, a quiet resolve, the kind that had carried him through decades in politics. He wasn't running from the fight. He was choosing his battlefield. While the nation buzzed with speculation about how he'd respond, Kennedy was already thinking beyond the studio, beyond the hashtags, and the headlines. He saw an opportunity not to score points or settle a score, but to remind people what really mattered. Tarlov's words had stung, no question, but they'd also handed him a platform, and he intended to use it. Back in New York, the broadcast wrapped. and Tarlov stepped off the set, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The studio lights dimmed, but the weight of her words followed her like a shadow. In the green room, she finally checked her phone, her thumb scrolling through a flood of notifications. Some messages were kind. You spoke truth, but most were brutal, calling her unprofessional, biased, even cruel. One stood out from a colleague at Fox. "Jess, what were you thinking? This is bad." She sank into a chair, her mind racing. She'd wanted to make a point to challenge what she saw as dangerous policy, but had she gone too far? The word psycho echoed in her head, no longer a weapon, but a mistake, one that might cost her more than she'd ever imagined. The internet, meanwhile, showed no mercy. X was a battlefield, with users digging up old clips of Tarlov's commentaries, searching for patterns of aggression or bias. A conservative blogger posted a montage titled Jessica Tarlov's Greatest Hits, splicing her most heated moments into a damning reel that racked up views. On the other side, progressive activists rallied around her, framing her outburst as a bold stand against outdated politics. Jessica Tarlov said, "What we're all thinking," one influencer tweeted, sparking a thread that stretched thousands of replies deep. The polarization was instant, predictable, and relentless, each side carving out its trench in a war of words that showed no sign of slowing. In the Fox News offices, executives convened an emergency meeting. Tarlov's outburst wasn't just a PR headache. It was a potential liability. Kennedy was a respected figure, not just in Louisiana, but across the conservative base, and alienating his supporters could hurt ratings. Yet Tarlov was a valuable asset, her liberal perspective essential to the network's balance. Firing her was an option, but a risky one. Her fans would cry foul, and the backlash could be fierce. "We need to let this cool off," one executive argued. "Give her a chance to clarify." Another shook his head. "Clarify?" She called a senator a psycho on live TV. "There's no walking that back." The room fell silent, the weight of the decision pressing down. For now, they agreed to monitor the situation, but Tarlov's future hung in the balance. As night fell, Tarlov sat alone in her Manhattan apartment, the city's glow filtering through her window. The TV was off, but her phone kept buzzing, each notification a reminder of the storm she'd unleashed. She opened her laptop, pulling up the clip of her outburst. Watching herself, she winced, not at the conviction in her voice, but at the venom. Psycho wasn't a policy critique. It was a personal attack, and she knew it. Doubt crept in, a rare visitor for someone so sure of her footing. Had she let her frustration with the system boil over into something uglier? Had she misjudged Kennedy, a man she'd never met, but whose policies she'd studied for years? The questions gnawed at her, but there was no undoing what she'd said. The world was watching, and so was Kennedy. In Louisiana, Kennedy's plane touched down under a starlit sky. He stepped onto the tarmac, his suit slightly rumpled, his expression calm but focused. A small crowd of local supporters greeted him, their signs reading, "We stand with Kennedy." He shook hands, cracked a few jokes, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd already called ahead to a community center in Baton Rouge, a place struggling to keep its doors open after budget cuts. Tomorrow he'd visit not with cameras or a press entourage, but with a plan to listen and help. Tarlov's words had lit a fire, but Kennedy wasn't interested in fanning the flames. He wanted to build something to show that leadership wasn't about winning arguments on TV, it was about showing up for the people who needed you most. The nation, unaware of Kennedy's plans, buzzed with speculation. Pundits on rival networks dissected Tarlov's outburst, some calling it a career ender, others a rallying cry. Talk radio hosts took calls from listeners, their voices a mix of anger and excitement. "She's done one," caller said. Kennedy's gonna sue her for defamation. Another laughed. He'll probably just quote Mark Twain and move on. No one knew what Kennedy would do, but everyone agreed on one thing. This was no ordinary news cycle. Tarlov's words had struck a nerve, and the country was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. In her apartment, Tarlov poured a glass of wine, her hands still shaky. She thought about her mother, a schoolteacher who'd taught her to argue with facts, not insults. She thought about her career, the years spent building credibility in a cutthroat industry. And she thought about Kennedy, a man she'd reduced to a single word on national television. For the first time, she wondered what he was doing right now, how he was processing the attack. Was he angry, plotting revenge, or was he, as some of his supporters claimed, simply above it all? She didn't know, but she felt a growing unease, a sense that this story was far from over. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its midst. But across the country, in homes and diners and offices, people were talking. They talked about Tarlov, about Kennedy, about the state of a nation where words like psycho could fly so easily, where division felt like the default. Some saw Tarlov as a hero, others a villain. Some saw Kennedy as a victim, others a statesman biding his time. But no one could look away. The spark had been struck, and the storm was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of a Baton Rouge community center, its faded sign reading Hope Haven in peeling letters. The building, a squat brick structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, had seen better days. Once a hub for after-school programs and job training, it now struggled to keep its lights on its budget, slashed by years of municipal neglect. Inside, a small group of volunteers sorted donated books and mopped scuffed floors, their chatter mingling with the hum of an old air conditioner. Outside, a black SUV pulled up unremarkable, except for the man who stepped out, Thung Ngisi John Kennedy. His tie loosened his face, etched with a quiet determination. No cameras followed him, no press vans lined the street. This wasn't a photo op. It was something else entirely, a response to a firestorm that had begun with a single word: psycho. Back in New York, Jessica Tarlov woke to a city that felt colder, though the summer heat pressed against her apartment windows. Her phone, still on silent, glowed with notifications, hundreds of messages, most unread, a mix of venom and faint praise. The clip of her calling Kennedy a psycho on Fox News had metastasized overnight, shared across platforms, dissected on morning shows, and weaponized by both sides of the political divide. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the moment she'd crossed that invisible line. The word had felt righteous in the heat of the debate, a jab at Kennedy's policies she'd long found infuriating. But now, in the harsh light of morning, it felt like a misstep, a crack in the armor she'd spent years forging as a commentator. She sipped coffee, staring at her laptop screen where X pulsed with activity. Tarlov attacks, Kennedy still trended, but a new hashtag was gaining traction, #Kennedy Cares. She clicked it, curious despite herself, and found herself scrolling through a stream of posts that painted a very different picture from the one she'd drawn on live TV. In Baton Rouge, Kennedy knelt on the community center's gym floor, tossing a basketball to a lanky teenager named Marcus, whose shy grin betrayed his excitement. The senator had arrived unannounced, his staff trailing with boxes of school supplies and a check from a local business he'd persuaded to donate. The center's director, a no-nonsense woman named Clara, watched from the sidelines, her arms crossed, but her eyes softening. "Didn't expect a senator to show up on a Wednesday," she said half to herself. Kennedy caught the ball and passed it back to Marcus, his drawl carrying over the squeak of sneakers. "Didn't expect to be called a psycho on TV either, but here we are." The room laughed, the tension breaking like a wave. He didn't linger on the insult, didn't milk it for sympathy. Instead, he asked Clara what the center needed most: computers, she said, and a new roof. He nodded, jotting notes on a crumpled pad, promising to make calls. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real, and the handful of parents and kids in the room felt it. Word of Kennedy's visit spread slowly at first, carried by a volunteer's Instagram post, a grainy photo of the senator, high-fiving Marcus, captioned, "This man gets it. #KennedyCares." By noon, the post had thousands of shares amplified by locals who'd seen the senator's SUV parked outside Hope Haven. A Baton Rouge news outlet picked it up, running a short segment that evening. While the nation debates a TV spat, Senator John Kennedy quietly shows up for Louisiana kids. The segment included a clip of Kennedy speaking to the group. His voice steady but warm. "Folks can say what they want about me," he said, pausing to wink at Marcus. "But they can't say I don't care about this place. You're my people, and I'm here for you." The words weren't polished, but they landed like a stone in still water ripples, spreading far beyond the gym. In New York, Tarlov watched the clip on her phone, her coffee growing cold. She'd expected Kennedy to fire back with a press conference, maybe a barbed quip on X, or a guest spot on a rival network. That's how the game was played, tit for tat, soundbite for soundbite. But this was different. He hadn't mentioned her name, hadn't even addressed the psycho comment directly. Instead, he'd gone to a struggling community center, rolled up his sleeves, and done something tangible. She felt a pang, not just of guilt, but of disorientation. She'd painted him as a caricature, a reckless ideologue, but the man in the clip was grounded, human, even likable. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her producer. "Jess, you seeing this? Kennedy's playing chess while we're playing checkers." She didn't reply. She didn't know how. The internet, ever hungry for a narrative, began to shift. Conservative accounts on X hailed Kennedy as a class act, sharing photos of him carrying boxes of notebooks into Hope Haven. "This is how you respond to hate," one user wrote. The post liked tens of thousands of times. But it wasn't just conservatives. Moderates, independents, even some liberals chimed in, impressed by Kennedy's restraint. "Didn't think I'd say this, but Kennedy's got my respect," a self-described progressive tweeted, sparking a thread of surprised agreement. The #KennedyCares hashtag climbed higher, overtaking Tarlov attacks Kennedy by mid-afternoon. Tarlov scrolled through the posts, her stomach tightening. She wasn't just losing the narrative, she was becoming the villain in it. At Fox News headquarters, the mood was tense. The executive suite buzzed with debate over how to handle Tarlov's fallout. Her outburst had spiked ratings, but it had also drawn fire from Kennedy's supporters, who flooded the network's social media with demands for an apology. "She can't stay on air after that," one executive argued, citing the risk of alienating viewers. Another pushed back, "Fire her, and we lose the liberal audience. Plus, she's good TV." They agreed to keep her on for now, but with a warning: clean up the mess or face consequences. Tarlov, unaware of the closed-door talks, sat in a coffee shop near her apartment, trying to focus on her next appearance. Her notebook lay open, but her pen hadn't moved in minutes. She kept thinking about Kennedy, about the kids in that gym, about the way he'd turned her attack into something constructive. It wasn't fair, she thought, but it was effective. That evening, Tarlov's phone lit up with an email that stopped her cold. It was from a high school student in Louisiana, a girl named Aisha, who'd been at Hope Haven during Kennedy's visit. The email was polite, but direct. "Ms. Tarlov, I saw what you said about Senator Kennedy on TV. I don't know much about politics, but I know he showed up for us today. He listened to my mom talk about how hard it is to pay for my school supplies. He didn't have to do that. Maybe you don't like him, but calling him a psycho hurt people here who trust him. I hope you'll think about that." Attached was a photo of Aisha and her mother smiling with Kennedy in the background, a basketball tucked under his arm. Tarlov stared at the image, her throat tightening. She'd expected hate mail, maybe threats. But this was worse. It was earnest human, a reminder that her words had reached beyond the studio, beyond the screen, into lives she'd never considered. She set the phone down and walked to her window, the city's skyline glittering against the dusk. Aisha's email had cracked something open, a sliver of doubt that grew with each passing hour. Tarlov had built her career on conviction, on the belief that her arguments were not just right, but necessary. She'd seen Kennedy's policies, his push for deregulation, his skepticism of renewable energy as threats to progress, to the planet, to the future. But had she misjudged the man behind them? The clip of him at Hope Haven played again in her mind, his easy smile, his lack of rancor. He hadn't used her attack to rally his base or demonize her. He'd done something better, he'd shown up. And in doing so, he'd made her words look small, petty, out of touch. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, Kennedy's visit to Hope Haven was just the beginning. Over the next day, he crisscrossed Baton Rouge, stopping at a food bank, a veterans' shelter, and a small business hit hard by recent storms. At each stop, he listened more than he spoke, asking questions, taking notes, promising to follow up. Locals shared stories of his visits on X, their posts unpolished but heartfelt. "Senator Kennedy just bought coffee for everyone at my diner. Said he wanted to hear our stories. #Kennedy cares." Another user, a single dad, posted a video of Kennedy helping unload canned goods at the food bank, his suit jacket slung over a chair. This is who Jessica Tarlov called a psycho. Nah, this man's the real deal. The videos spread, each one a brick in a wall of goodwill that Tarlov couldn't ignore. By the second day, the media had caught up. National outlets, hungry for a counterpoint to Tarlov's outburst, sent reporters to Louisiana, their cameras capturing Kennedy at a community garden, his hands dirty from planting seedlings alongside kids. CNN ran a segment titled "Kennedy's Quiet Rebuttal," praising his focus on community over controversy. Even MSNBC, rarely kind to conservatives, aired a grudgingly positive piece, with one anchor noting Tarlov may have started this fight, but Kennedy's finishing it on his terms. The coverage was a gut punch for Tarlov, who watched it unfold from a Fox News green room, her next appearance looming. Her colleagues, usually quick with banter, kept their distance, their silence louder than any critique. She felt exposed not just to the public, but to herself, her confidence eroding with each new story about Kennedy's outreach. Tarlov's next segment on The Five was a test, and she knew it. The producers had instructed her to address the controversy without doubling down a tightrope she wasn't sure she could walk. As the cameras rolled, she felt the weight of millions of eyes, some hoping for redemption, others for a train wreck. Dana Perino, ever the professional, tossed her a soft opening. "Jessica, you've been in the headlines. Want to share your thoughts?" Tarlov took a breath, her voice steadier than she felt. "I stand by my concerns about certain policies," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But I regret the way I expressed them. My job is to debate ideas, not attack people." It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a step, and the panel moved on quickly, sensing her discomfort. Viewers noticed, though, and X lit up with reactions, some calling her words hollow, others seeing a crack in her armor. Back in Louisiana, Kennedy sat in a diner, a plate of untouched eggs cooling in front of him. His staff had shown him Tarlov's segment, but he waved it off. "She's got her own path," he said, sipping coffee. "I'm not here to pile on." Instead, he pulled out his notebook, scribbling ideas for a bill to fund community centers like Hope Haven. His staff marveled at his focus, his ability to tune out the noise. But Kennedy wasn't oblivious. He knew the power of his actions, knew that every handshake, every conversation was a rebuttal to Tarlov's attack louder than any press conference could be. He wasn't playing to the cameras, he was playing to the people, and they were listening. Tarlov, meanwhile, couldn't escape Aisha's email. She printed it out, tucking it into her notebook as a reminder of the lives behind the headlines. She began researching Kennedy, not just his voting record, but his work in Louisiana flood relief efforts, small business grants, even his habit of answering constituent letters by hand. The more she read, the more her caricature of him unraveled. He wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a psycho either. He was a man with flaws and convictions like her, like anyone. The realization didn't absolve her, but it shifted something, a seed of accountability taking root. As the week drew to a close, Tarlov faced a choice. She could dig in, defend her outburst, and ride the wave of support from her base. Or she could confront her mistake, not just for the cameras, but for herself. She wasn't ready to apologize, not yet. But Aisha's words echoed a challenge to be better. In Louisiana, Kennedy wrapped up his tour at a church where he spoke briefly to a small congregation. "Folks will judge you, call you names," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But you don't answer hate with hate. You answer it with work. With heart, with home." The congregation nodded, and a local live-streamed the moment, sending it rippling across the internet. Tarlov watched the stream from her apartment, her eyes stinging. Kennedy's words weren't aimed at her, but they hit like a mirror held to her face. She closed her laptop, the room falling silent. Outside, the city churned, but inside a storm of her own was brewing, not of anger, but of reckoning. The nation watched, waiting for her next move, but for the first time Tarlov wasn't thinking about the headlines. She was thinking about Aisha, about Marcus, about the people she'd hurt with a single word. And somewhere in Louisiana, Kennedy was already moving forward, his focus on the next community, the next need, leaving the firestorm behind, but its lessons lingering. The Fox News studio, usually a hive of frenetic energy, felt eerily still as Jessica Tarlov stepped onto the set for her first major appearance since the firestorm. The lights were the same, the cameras unblinking, but the air carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Her outburst calling Thung Ngisi, John Kennedy, a psycho on live television had ignited a national conversation, and the echoes of that moment still reverberated across social media newsrooms and kitchen tables. Tonight, she'd been given a chance to address it head-on, not in a quick segment, but in a prime-time special, a 30-minute slot where she'd face questions from a seasoned host and an audience of millions. Tarlov's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her earpiece, her notes untouched on the table. She'd refused the producer's offer of prepped questions, insisting on an open format. No fences, she'd told them, her voice firm, but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. This wasn't about salvaging her career anymore. It was about facing herself. In Baton Rouge, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink over a community park, where Kennedy stood surrounded by a diverse crowd. The event was a fundraiser for Hope Haven, the community center he'd visited days earlier, now bustling with volunteers, local businesses, and families. Tents dotted the grass, offering free food and games for kids, while a small stage hosted a local band playing Zydeco. Kennedy, in a rolled-up dress shirt, moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands and listening to stories, a grandmother worried about her grandson's school, a mechanic struggling with rent, a teenager dreaming of college. He'd organized the event in just 48 hours, leveraging his network, to secure donations and rally support. The media was there, but Kennedy kept them at a distance, insisting this wasn't about headlines. It was about community, about showing what could be built when division was set aside. Yet the nation was watching, and so was Tarlov, from a green room 200 miles away, where a monitor played a live feed of the fundraiser. Tarlov's heart sank as she watched Kennedy kneel to tie a little girl's shoe, the crowd cheering as he handed her a balloon. The contrast was stark, her words sharp and divisive against his actions warm and unifying. The past week had been a crucible for her, each day peeling back layers of certainty she'd once worn like armor. Aisha's email, the high school student who'd called her out with quiet grace, had been the first crack. Then came the stories of Kennedy's outreach food banks, shelters, gardens, each one a rebuttal to her psycho label, not with anger but with purpose. She'd spent hours researching him, poring over his speeches, his letters to constituents, his work on flood relief. The man she'd reduced to a caricature was complex, flawed, but fiercely dedicated, and the realization had left her unmoored. Tonight, she had a chance to set things right, but the words she needed felt just out of reach. The special began with a montage. Tarlov's outburst, Kennedy's visit to Hope Haven, the viral posts under #KennedyCares. The host, Brett Bayer, welcomed her with a nod, his tone neutral but probing. "Jessica, you've been at the center of a storm. What do you want America to know?" Tarlov took a breath, her voice steady but raw. "I was wrong," she said, the words cutting through the studio's silence. "I called Senator Kennedy a psycho in a moment of anger, and I regret it, not just because it was unprofessional, but because it was unfair. I didn't see the man behind the policies, the person who's showing up for people every day. I let frustration win, and I hurt people in the process." The admission hung heavy, her eyes glistening but resolute. Bayer pressed gently, "What changed your mind?" Tarlov paused, then reached into her pocket, pulling out a folded printout of Aisha's email. "This," she said, her voice catching. "A teenager from Louisiana reminded me that words have weight, that they reach real people with real lives." And then I watched Senator Kennedy respond not with attacks but with action. That's when I knew I'd misjudged him. The broadcast cut to a split screen showing Kennedy at the fundraiser, unaware of Tarlov's words. He was speaking to the crowd now, his drawl carrying over the microphone. "We're here because we're family," he said, gesturing to the tense and smiling faces. "Not because we agree on everything, but because we care about each other. That's what makes us strong." The crowd applauded, and in homes across the country, viewers leaned closer to their screens, sensing a moment unfolding. Back in the studio, Tarlov watched the feed, her hands clasped tightly. Bayer, sensing the weight, shifted gears. "If you could speak to Senator Kennedy now, what would you say?" Tarlov looked directly into the camera, her voice soft but clear. "Senator, I'm sorry. I didn't just attack you. I dismissed the people who trust you, who see you as their voice. I promise to do better, to listen, to build, instead of tear down." The studio was silent, the crew exchanging glances. This wasn't the polished spin they'd expected. It was raw, vulnerable, real. In Baton Rouge, the fundraiser paused as Kennedy's death rushed to his side, showing him a tablet streaming Tarlov's apology. The crowd, sensing something big, grew quiet, their eyes on the senator. Kennedy watched the clip, his expression unreadable, then handed the tablet back. "She's got courage," he said softly, almost to himself. Then, to his staff's surprise, he asked for a phone and dialed a number. Minutes later, Fox News producers scrambled as their switchboard lit up with an incoming call. "John Kennedy live from Louisiana. asking to speak on air. Bayer, unflappable, patched him through and the nation held its breath. Jessica Kennedy began, his voice calm but firm. I heard you just now. I accept your apology, not because I need it, but because this country needs to see what it looks like to move forward. Tarlov's hand covered her mouth, tears welling. Kennedy continued, We don't have to agree, but we can respect each other. That's what I'm trying to do down here, and I believe you can too. The call ended, and the studio erupted in murmurs. Bayer visibly moved. That, he said, is something you don't see every day. The moment went viral, instantly clips of Tarlov's apology and Kennedy's response flooding X, YouTube, and TikTok. Grace over hate trended alongside #Kennedy cares, with users from all sides sharing reactions. This is what leadership looks like, one wrote. Tarlov owned her mistake, and Kennedy didn't gloat. Respect. Another posted, I'm a liberal, but Kennedy just showed me what class is. The conversation shifted no longer about who was right or wrong, but about what it meant to rise above. In Baton Rouge, the fundraiser took on new energy, the crowd buzzing with pride in their senator. A single mother named Lena, who'd spoken with Kennedy earlier, took the stage, her voice trembling. I was mad when I heard what that lady said about our senator, she said. But tonight, I saw her apologize, and I saw him forgive. That's what I want my kids to learn, not to hate, but to heal. The crowd cheered, and a local news camera caught the moment, sending it rippling across the internet. Tarlov left the studio that night, her steps lighter, despite the emotional weight. She'd expected to feel exposed, even humiliated, but instead she felt unburdened. The apology hadn't erased her mistake, but it had opened a door, one she hadn't known she needed. Her phone buzzed with a new email, this time from Aisha's mother, thanking her for her honesty. You showed my daughter. It's okay to be wrong, as long as you make it right. It read. Tarlov smiled, tears stinging again. She replied with a simple, thank you for raising such a wise young woman. The exchange, small but profound, grounded her in a way her career never had. She began to see her role differently, not as a combatant in a TV arena, but as a voice with the power to shape, to hurt, or to heal. The next day, Kennedy sent a surprise invitation to join him at a charity event in Washington, D.C. to support community centers like Hope Haven. Tarlov hesitated, unsure if she could face him in person, but Aisha's email echoed in her mind. She accepted boarding a flight with a mix of nerves and resolve. The event, held in a modest convention center, was a far cry from the polished Fox News set. Volunteers served hot meals, kids played in a bounce house, and donors mingled with community leaders. Kennedy greeted Tarlov warmly, his handshake firm, his smile genuine. Glad you're here, he said, no trace of resentment. They worked side by side, serving food and chatting with attendees. One moment stood out. A retired teacher approached them, her eyes misty. You two remind me that we're not as broken as we think, she said. Thank you for showing us how to talk again. Tarlov and Kennedy exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge they'd begun to build. As the event wound down, Tarlov took the microphone unscripted. Her voice steady now. I called this man a psycho, she said, gesturing to Kennedy, and I was wrong. But he didn't just forgive me. He invited me here to see what he's fighting for. This isn't about politics. It's about people, about choosing grace over rage. The crowd applauded, and Kennedy joined her, adding, Jessica's right. We're here to lift each other up, not tear each other down. That's the America I believe in. The words resonated not as a soundbite, but as a call to action, a reminder that division wasn't inevitable. The event's impact spread far beyond the room. News outlets covered it with a rare sense of hope. Headlines reading, "Tarlov and Kennedy unite for charity," and "a lesson in forgiveness." Social media buzzed with stories from attendees, one viral post showing Tarlov and Kennedy laughing with a group of kids captioned, "This is what healing looks like." Schools began using the story in civics classes, teachers asking students, "What does it mean to apologize? To forgive?" In a small Louisiana classroom, Aisha raised her hand. "It means you care enough to try again," she said, her words echoing her email to Tarlov. The teacher smiled, sensing a generation learning what hers had often forgotten. The lesson of this story is clear. Words have power to wound, to divide, but also to heal. Tarlov's mistake was human, her apology courageous, and Kennedy's forgiveness transformative. Their journey shows that real strength lies not in winning arguments, but in building bridges, in choosing empathy over enmity. For listeners, the challenge is to reflect on their own words, their own biases, and ask, how can I contribute to a world that values respect over rage? This isn't just a story about two people. It's a call to each of us to speak with intention, to listen with openness, and to act with the kind of grace that can mend a fractured nation. In classrooms, workplaces, and homes, let this be a reminder: we fall, we rise, and we grow together, one honest step at a time.